Guten Tag and welcome to PA Dutch 101. This is video 29 in our series and we'll be covering the topic of reflexive verbs. This is a grammar-based video. I would advise you to watch the previous videos if you have not before jumping into this one. This is a rather advanced lesson. You need to be able to understand sentence structure, conjugation of verbs, and the use of pronouns before really tackling reflexive verbs. So I would advise you to watch those videos if you haven't done so. If you have, let's jump into reflexive verbs. Or, as I guess I could call them in Dutch, sich verbs, because we're going to find out that all the verbs that are reflexive take this guy, sich. And I'll explain that more here in the video. Alright, so what are reflexive verbs? Well, certain verbs in Pennsylvania Dutch need a pronoun object which refers back to the subject. And I have that in caps to remind us that we're always dealing with going back to the subject. It's referring back to the subject. Okay? These verbs are called reflexive verbs because, and sometimes can best be translated in English as myself verbs. We have these in English, but they don't work exactly the same as they do in Dutch. So your knowledge of English grammar isn't really going to help you all that much in making the transition to how these work in Pennsylvania Dutch. If you've studied German before, these will be very similar to how German uses and utilizes reflexive verbs. But it's not exactly the same either, so we have to be a little careful. Pennsylvania Dutch really is its own unique form of these and how they're used. Okay, here's an example of one in English. I am washing my hands. Now, we don't have necessarily a reflexive pronoun, kind of. The my in this case is what's reflecting back on the subject. I am washing my hands. It's reflecting back. And that's the way you have to think about these. It's a little weird at first to get this concept into our minds. But the sooner you understand that idea that we're always talking about something as part of ourselves, or he about him, or you about your, then you start to, it should start to click. Okay? The my is reflecting back on the subject, and that's why we're saying they're reflexive. They reflect back onto the subject. Okay. Now, this is going to seem like a lot, but just bear with me. The normal sentence structure for reflexive verbs is, and there's a couple different situations. I'm going to give you all the situations at first. Don't feel overwhelmed. It's going to seem like a lot, but you'll understand here in a minute. So in a normal situation, present tense sentence with nothing but subject verb, this is what you need to get into your brain. Our word order is going to be subject, followed by the verb, followed by the reflexive pronoun, and then your other stuff. I always like to tell my students, think about it this way. The subject is a piece of bread, the reflexive pronoun is a piece of bread, which makes sense because they're related to each other, and the verb's going to be the meat, and together they make a sandwich. The subject and the reflexive pronoun go around the verb in a normal sentence, normal situation. Okay? If we were to turn this into a question, now essentially we have an open-faced sandwich. We have our verb, then our subject, inverted word order, then the reflexive pronoun. Notice, it's still up front, so to speak. It's with the subject, okay? Then the other stuff. So the only difference between our question and our sentence is that we're flipping our verb and our subject. We're still keeping our reflexive pronoun close to the subject. Okay? Now, where things get a little funny is if we start to throw other variables into the sentence. In this case, what if we had a modal? Well, then it would be subject, your conjugated form of modal, reflexive pronoun, other stuff, and verb all the way to the end. If you remember your rules for modals, you know that a modal sends a verb to the end. That doesn't change here. The only thing we have to remember is if we're dealing with reflexive verbs and reflexive pronouns, now we got to keep this guy right here. And again, we're kind of making a sandwich between the subject and the reflexive pronoun, but this time the modal goes in between and the verb gets forced to the end. Okay? No matter what, and here's the big thing, you always need a reflexive pronoun in your sentence. If you are using a reflexive verb, you must have the reflexive pronoun, otherwise you're not doing it correctly. Okay? So that's why when we learn these, or when you learn these, every one of them is going to have a sich in front of them. That's your clue to let you know this is a reflexive verb. I need to have a form of that sich somewhere in my sentence. Okay? That's what you have to remember. Here's an example of this in Dutch. The verb to comb one's hair is zich strelen. Okay? Now in a second I'm going to say why we use mich here, but the ich is your subject, strelen is your verb, mich is our reflexive pronoun, and then here's our other stuff, as hoa. Ich strele mich as hoa. I'm combing my hair. Your mich and your ich are your subject and your reflexive pronoun. These are forming the bread of your sandwich, and the verb is in the middle. Okay? It follows exactly this first example. Okay? Now, what are the reflexive pronouns? You have to memorize these. As stated before, all of these sentences have reflexive pronouns in them, and this is what reflects back on the subject. So, I have our personal pronouns here, ich, du, er, sie, es, mir, dir, sie, which we've covered many, many times before. If these are your subject of the sentence, then these guys are your reflexive pronoun. So if the subject is ich, the reflexive pronoun is mich. And that was in the example sentence we just had. Ich strele mich as hoa. If du is the subject, your reflexive pronoun is dich. If er, sie, or es, or one person's name, Bob or Susan, then it's sich is your reflexive pronoun. If mir is the subject, then it's uns. If it's dir, eich. And if it's sie, it's sich. If you remember when we learned the accusative case video, we talked about the accusative pronouns, personal pronouns, mich, dich, uns, and eich. We learned those before. We quickly see, oh, they get used again with reflexive pronouns. But where the difference lies is within the er, sie, es goes to sich, and the sie goes to sich. So those are a little different from the accusative personal pronouns, but these four are exactly the same. So you have most of these already memorized. That's good. That helps. Okay? Now we just got to remember that when we're building sentences with reflexive pronouns and reflexive verbs, we got to use these red guys in our sentences. Every time. Okay? Here are some common reflexive verbs. Now, these are not all of them. There are a lot of reflexive verbs in Pennsylvania Dutch, and if you have your dictionaries, when you're paging through them, you'll quickly realize that there are a lot. And they'll always be given in this format. The sich will be up front. That makes you know right away that it is a reflexive verb. So I'm just going to give a couple of common ones that you'll probably use quicker than some of the other ones that are in a dictionary. And notice, some of them have a lot of things going on. So not only is this a reflexive verb with sich, it's also a separable prefix verb, which we went over in a previous video as well. So all of the rules that apply with a separable prefix verb also apply with this. The only thing we're adding now is that we also have to have it in a reflexive format. See what I mean? It's a lot starting to come together now since we've learned so many different things. Don't be scared by it. You already know how to do reflexive separable prefix verbs. That you know how to do. So the only thing we're doing now is we're doing all that, but then we're also incorporating this new bit, which is the reflexive pronoun. Okay? So, sich adu. Sich adu. Sich adu is to get dressed. Here's another reflexive that also is a separable prefix. Sich aufputze. Sich aufputze. Sich aufputze. To dress up. Now, to, the same meaning. Sich balbiere. Sich balbiere. Sich balbiere. Or sich rasiere, sich rasiere, sich rasiere, to shave. Okay? Depends where you are as opposed to which one gets used. I grew up knowing balbiere, but there is also the possibility of using rasiere. Sich wäsche, sich wäsche, sich wäsche, to wash oneself. Here's another separable prefix, it's also reflexive. Sich wehdu, sich wehdu, sich wehdu, to injure oneself or to hurt oneself. One we had in our previous example, sich strele, sich strele, sich strele, to comb one's hair. Here are a couple more. Now again, they both mean the same thing. They're both separable prefixes plus reflexives. It depends which one, where you are. Sich anhocken. Sich anhocken. Sich anhocken. Or sich hinhocken. Sich hinhocken. Sich hinhocken. Both mean to sit down. I grew up using this one, but both are okay. Hock dich hi, as my grandmother would often say. Hock dich hi. Flexible. Okay? Sich verkelde. Sich verkelde. Sich verkelde. To catch a cold. Or to get sick. Sich bade. Sich bade. Sich bade. To bathe oneself. One my father used a lot when we were kids. Sich dummele. Sich dummele. Sich dummele. To hurry oneself up. Or to hurry. Another reflexive that's also a separable prefix. Sich aufwecken. Sich aufwecken. Sich aufwecken. To wake up. Again, that was a short list. That is by no means an all-inclusive list. There are a lot of other verbs out there that are reflexives. And again, any dictionary that you have will tell you which verbs are reflexive and which ones aren't. Okay. Now, let's start practicing this stuff and actually put all of the tools to work. So, when doing these, remember the word order. That's key. All right. Subject, verb, reflexive pronoun, other stuff. I'm going to keep it pretty easy here for a little bit. No other variables, no modals, no questions. Let's just do it straightforward so we understand that. So, if we want to say, I am shaving, how would we do that? Our subject, I'll give you the answer and we'll talk through it. So, our subject is ich. The verb is sich balvieren. So, we use our subject, ich. We conjugate our verb, and then we got to figure out what's next, which in this case is the reflexive pronoun. In this sentence, there is no other stuff, so get rid of that. Now, how did I know to use mich? Because I looked back at my chart of reflexive pronouns, and the reflexive pronoun for ich is mich. Ich balviere mich. I am shaving literally myself. Okay, we don't say that in English, but that's what you'd say in Dutch. Alright? He is bathing. Now, we just had the verb to bathe. It's one of our reflexives. The subject, of course, would be he. Conjugate our verb, badet, and then your reflexive pronoun, which in this case would be sich, because our subject is Alright, we look back at our reflexive pronouns chart. Now here's one where we do have some other stuff. We are combing our hair. Subject, mir, for we. The verb is sich strelen, so strelen. Now we need our reflexive pronoun. You look at your chart, the reflexive pronoun for mir is uns, and then the other stuff, es Haar. Wir strelen uns es Haar. Okay? It seems tricky at first, I'm sure. You gotta stick with it and just follow the rules, and you'll be okay. Klein bisschen mehr üben, a little bit more practice. So, I'm going to give you everything you need, but you need to take it and then build sentences. And feel free to pause the video, do the exercise, and then hit play and check your answer. So here's the first situation I want you to build a sentence out of. Our subject is du. The reflexive verb that I want to use is sich hinhocken, and other stuff in this case in die Küche. In the end, I want you to be able to say, you are sitting down in the kitchen. Okay? So feel free to pause the video, try it, and come back. If you did it correctly, du hockst dich in die Küche hi. Alright? Now, what's all going on here? Subject is du. We need our verb. But hopefully you remembered that this is a separable prefix verb. So the he part comes off, goes all the way to the end. If you forgot that, it's a small mistake. Did you have dich? That's important. Did you have dich? Did you have this word order? If the only thing you messed up was having the he with the hockst, I would let that go for now, but I would say, hey, don't forget, you have to move this here. I'm more concerned at this point, are you doing these things correctly? Do you have this word order? That's important to understand how these work, okay? Of course, I want you to have the he at the end, and as you practice, hopefully you'll remember that. If you forgot, maybe you didn't, and if you did this correctly right off the bat, pat yourself on the back, because this is not easy at first, okay? So, du hockst dich in die Küche, he. Try this one. Der Andy misse sich dummle. Be careful. I threw something at you here. Our verb is sich dummle, but I also gave you a modal. Remember the rules, what to do with a modal. You also have to remember how to conjugate the modal. Be careful. Pause the video, try it, come back. If you did it correctly, der Andy muss sich dummle. Der Andy muss sich dummle. So our subject, der Andy, then comes our modal, which the conjugated form of misse is muss for der Andy. Then your reflexive pronoun, the reflexive pronoun for der Andy, which would be he would be sich. And then our verb stays the same at the end, dummle, infinitive form, because we have a modal. Der Andy muss sich dummle. How about one more? Our verb this time is sich aufputze. Our subject is dir verkehrt. And I want this in the form of a question. So now, question word order. There's no modals. There's nothing else weird at play here. It's just straightforward. Put it in the right word order. Go. This time, since it's a question, you need to start with the verb. So, putzt. This is, think of it like the open-faced sandwich. So the meat, bread, and then the rest. Putzt dir Eich für Karich Uf. Hopefully you also remember that Ufputze is a separable prefix, so the Uf has to go all the way to the end. But did you have verb, subject, reflexive pronoun? That's important. Putzt dir Eich für Karich Uf. Okay? Are you guys getting dressed up for church? Okay? Whew. That might seem like a lot, because it is. Reflexive verbs and reflexive pronouns are not a very easy topic. That's why it's been to this late in the video series till I introduced it. Because there's a lot of things you have to know how to do before getting to this. And hopefully by this point in the video series, doing the basic stuff like conjugating verbs, conjugating modals, understanding sentence structure, you already had in the bag. So that when I introduce these new types of verbs, those things are already in your brain, so you didn't have to go back and think. If that wasn't the case, this probably was a lot of information all at once. Practice, that's all I can say. A good thing I think for now is practice making sentences with the verbs that I gave you. If you feel adventurous, page through your dictionaries and find other reflexive verbs. And maybe if you're keeping a notebook or something like that, maybe you want to make a list of all of the reflexive verbs that you come across. Of course, the ones that I gave you in the video, but also as you're flipping through a dictionary and you find a new one, jot it down in the list so that you have a central location with all your reflexive verbs that you're using or that you've found. And then start working with them. Create sentences. Talk to people. I hope by now you have someone in your house or a friend of yours that is willing to let you practice your Dutch on them. Okay? If not, find somebody. And which I can also advise, if you're in social media, if you use social media, Facebook, there are groups on Facebook. I've said this in previous videos, but I haven't seen anybody starting to take advantage of this. There are groups that are full of Dutch speakers, and I know I would personally love to help anybody out who needs help. Wants to practice, I'll practice with you. Find me on Facebook, find these groups. I've mentioned them before. Kannst du Deutsch schwätzen? Can you speak Dutch is one of them. I'm not Amish, but I speak Dutch is another group with Dutch speakers. Es Frühjahr für die Muttersprache, a springtime for the mother tongue. These are all pages and groups on Facebook where you can interact with other Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. And I am sure that the vast majority of them would be very happy to practice with you because that means and shows there are people interested in keeping our dialect alive. Okay? So don't be afraid. Or email me. I'll email you back. We can practice anytime you want. I will gladly do that. Okay? enough about that. So that was reflexive verbs in a nutshell. Practice, 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 as I always say at the end. And bis die nächste Video. Mach's gut und schwätz Deutsch.